Excellent. Thank you. Now, to just preface what I'm going to present here in brief, I want to call everybody's attention to a document which Mr. LaRouche authored earlier this week, which was published during the middle of this week on the LaRouche PAC website. This is titled, "The Present Hyperinflationary Crisis Worse Than Weimar." Now, the very beginning of this statement, you write, "I was born on September 8th, 1922, at the beginning of the process of the infamous 1923 hyperinflationary collapse of the economy of the Weimar Germany Republic. Now, the threat to the transatlantic economy, as of this date, is a far worse and virtually immediate threat for as long as current U.S. President Barack Obama remains in the presidency." So what we intend to do with a series of graphics is to illustrate the collapse of the physical economy of the United States and the growth of a hyperinflationary, worse than Weimar bubble since both the repeal of Glass-Steagall in 1999 and the election of Barack Obama in 2008. So let me just have the first slide here. This is titled World Financial Aggregates. Now, there are different estimates for the magnitude of what is presented on this slide. As people can see, financial aggregates are made up of, in this slide, three different categories: so-called stocks, debt, and then derivatives. And you see the derivatives in red are the vast majority of the world financial aggregates that are presented in this slide. Now, according to official Bank of International's BIS statistics, derivatives total around $700 trillion. However, according to other estimates, including estimates by EIR, that very well could be double of that number. Now, what you see here is, although starting in 1980, there was already the growth of the derivatives bubble. Going into 1999, which was the official repeal of Glass-Steagall. However, remember, during those 2 decades prior to the official repeal, Glass-Steagall was being continuously eroded by the actions of Alan Greenspan in the Federal Reserve. But after 1999, after the official repeal, the derivatives bubble exploded. And that goes all the way up to that slight dip there, which you see, which is the crash of 2007-2008. Now, what should have happened at that point is that entire derivatives bubble, that entire fictitious monetary bubble, should have collapsed. The entire thing should have disappeared. But instead of that, beginning with the George W. Bush administration, but then continuing with the Obama administration, quantitative easing, the policy of quantitative easing was adopted, and that led into the supporting and the continuation, the perpetuation of that derivatives bubble. Now, on this next slide, what we see is that starting in 2008, with the growth of QE, that top black line that you see there, cumulatively, we've reached a point where, because of the so-called asset purchasing program of the Federal Reserve, there has been almost $4 trillion in fictitious money that has been pushed into the United States economy. Now, what you see in conjunction with that is that bank deposits, indeed, have skyrocketed in parallel to the quantitative easing spending. However, those bank deposits have been in no way reflected into the real economy. There's been no growth in activity in the real economy during the quantitative easing regime during the first 5 years of the Obama administrations. And instead, what you've seen is that bank lending into the real economy has crashed. It crashed beginning in 2008, bottoming out in 2010, and has remained at that level ever since. Now, if you look at the next slide, you see what has actually happened in the real economy. While quantitative easing, while the regime of quantitative easing has reigned since 2008, and even going back to 1999, which was the repeal of Glass-Steagall, you've seen a constant decrease in labor participation rate. Now, what this means is the percentage of the eligible workforce, the eligible labor force of the population who are actually employed, either employed or are actively seeking employment. Now, you saw a slight decrease beginning in 1999, but look at what happens when Barack Obama is elected, 2008. It crashes precipitously and continues to crash. Now, this is significant because if you are to look at the number of people actually in what's called the civilian labor force, in other words, those who are either working or who are actively looking for work, that number hasn't changed at all. That's the so-called employment numbers that Obama is always trumpeting about. But the point is that there's been no growth in the active labor force since the time that Obama was elected. It was 155 million people in January of 2009, and it's 155 million people now. However, what has happened is that the working age population has grown over that period by close to 12 million people. So where did all of those potential workers go? Where did that 12 million person increase in the labor force go? They never appeared in the labor force. So at the same time, the total number of the civilian labor force, which is the number of people employed and those who are seeking employment, or the officially unemployed, at the same time that that has stayed exactly the same, the number of working age adults has either dropped off the rolls, who have either dropped off the rolls because they've been out of work too long, or those who never entered the labor force in the first place, those who graduated from school and have never actually gone into the labor rolls. That number has grown from 80 million people at the end of 2008 to 91.4 million people now. In other words, you have an invisible 12 million people who are out there in this country who essentially do not exist as a part of the United States labor force. So what you see here is a declining proportion represented in the graph that we had on the screen. That proportion taking a nosedive as soon as Obama enters office and then falling continuously every year since. And what we know from the studies is that real employment in the United States during the course of the Obama administration has reached a point, real unemployment has reached a point of nearly 26 million people. That's the 22 million people who are officially unemployed, according to official statistics. That's unemployed, underemployed, or discouraged from seeking work, plus another 4 million people on top of that who never entered the workforce in the first place during the last 5 years. And that is increasingly becoming what you could call a lost generation of youth. Now, let me have the next slide. Let's take a look at youth unemployment. Everybody has heard about the dramatic numbers of unemployed youth in Greece, in Spain, in other countries in Europe. This chart shows that since 2008, again, the beginning of the Obama administration and the beginning of the bailout austerity regime of Europe, you've had the percentages of real youth unemployment doubling, if not tripling, in these countries. This is calculated for those between the ages of 16 and 24. You have Cyprus, the green line here at the bottom, which has gone from 9% and doubled to 18%. You have Ireland, which has gone from 10% to 20%. You've got Italy and Portugal, which have gone from 20% to now almost 40%. And then you've got Greece and Spain tripling from 20% to almost 60%. So these numbers do not even include those who are discouraged from work, who are forced to be part-time, underemployed, nor does it include the massive exodus of young people who are emigrating from these countries in a desperate search to find work. Let me have the next slide here. This is a representation of the same data, but this is in a map. You can see here in 2008, again, the first year of the Obama administration, you have 6 countries in Europe that had greater than 20% youth unemployment. Take a look at the next slide. This is youth unemployment in Europe in the year 2012. 11 countries have youth unemployment of 20 to 30%. 5 countries have youth unemployment of between 30 and 40%. And 3 countries have youth unemployment greater than 40%. So, lest anybody say, yeah, well, that's Europe. That's over there. That's across the ocean. That could never happen here. Take a look at the same period of time, the 5 years since the beginning of the Obama administration. Take a look at that period of time here in the United States. This is the year 2008, the year that Obama was elected. You have 3 states in the country that had greater than 30% real unemployment. And by real, I mean in this case, including those who are forcibly underemployed and those who are marginally employed or marginally connected to the labor force, including those who are discouraged from finding work. You can see that those states are Michigan with 34%, Rhode Island with 31%, and California with 30%. Now, in the year 2013, 5 years into the Obama presidency, 30 states in the United States have greater than 30% youth unemployment or underemployment, so-called real youth unemployment. 14 are between 30 and 35%, 10 are between 35 and 40%, and 5 are greater than 40%. Nevada, Illinois, Mississippi, California, and North Carolina. So you can see that the picture on both sides of the Atlantic really reveals what is becoming a lost generation of young people. Very similar to what we saw before the Great Depression, in the years before Franklin Roosevelt took office. Just looking at the collapse in employment alone. But if you take a look at the next slide, if you look at the type of work that those who are even still employed are engaged in, you see that the situation now is even worse than what Franklin Roosevelt confronted then. What this slide shows is type of employment by activity as a percentage of the total labor force employed. And what you see is that right there in the beginning of the graph, 1940, during the course of Roosevelt's 3rd term, the number of workers that were engaged in productive work was increasing as a relative percentage of the workforce as a whole. And of course, this was during the war mobilization. It was during the so-called arsenal of democracy. However, as soon as Roosevelt died, and as soon as Truman took over, that increase began to reverse itself. And instead of blue-collar, skilled, productive work, you had an increase in white-collar, unskilled, service sector work. And the relative ratios between those two types of employment began to reverse themselves until after the Kennedys were assassinated, going right into the beginning of the 1970s. Ironically, in 1971, which was the very year that Mr. LaRouche had uniquely forecasted the crisis that hit the financial system and the economy at that time under Nixon. You see right there, 1970, 1971, the number of people employed in the service sector surpassed the number of people for the first time employed in producing goods. And then ever since, you've had a steady decline in the real economy, a net decline which has never reversed itself, while services, so-called including financial services, have steadily increased and all but taken over the entire U.S. labor force. So this is the picture of the post-Glass-Steagall financial speculation, all about money, Wall Street economy that's taken over this country today, and which Mr. LaRouche has characterized in this newest report as being truthfully worse than Weimar by far. So I want to give Lynn a chance to respond to what has just been presented, but we also have a second element which gets a little bit more deeply into some of the specifics in terms of food, in terms of health care, in terms of the essential goods that are necessary to support the lives of the American people. But if you want to respond on this first before we present the remaining, or we can present the remaining graphics now.
Yeah,
okay.
Right.
So let me ask Dennis to come to the podium. He'll present a little bit more detail on the deterioration of the conditions of life for the people of the United States, focusing on food, purchasing power, access to basic health care, and so forth.
Okay. So, Lynn, what you had said about the population of, or the policy of depopulation and the death rate increasing is not something that would happen out in the distance, but it's something that is actually happening right now. If we look at the first graphic, for those folks who do have jobs and are able to stay off the unemployment rolls, the ability to continue living has become increasingly more difficult over the course of the last decade and a half, and increasingly so since the beginning of the Barack Obama administration. Here we have a few basic commodities, and their prices have increased over the course since the year 2000 to 2012, which is the data that we have. And as you see here, things like beef, flour, potatoes nearly doubled in price. And similarly with, as the questioner who started off tonight's presentation indicated, the doubling of electricity prices. You have these pressures. Now, the green part on this graph shows what percentage of the overall increases have been taken care of by the increases of the salaries or the incomes of the people of the United States, and which covers about 20% of the increases, and then everything over that is simply inflation and hyperinflation. Now, looking a little bit closer at this, if we go to the second slide, some of the effects of this. This is the decline in per capita meat consumption from 1990 to 2012. Now, if you look first, the first thing I want to point out here is that if you look at when Obama came into office, 2008, you see a steep decline in people's eating of meat. Now, this is in total amount of weight which is sold, so it's not a ratio of how much per household, but this is the total amount of meat. One thing that I would point out here is that the forgive me, I need to find a note here, which I don't have. The population in 1990, where this graphic starts, of the United States was 250 million people. And then at the high point of this graph, which is around 2004, the population was increasing up to 292 million. Now, this fall in the consumption of meat is not related to a fall in the population of the United States. Up to 2012, we had 313 million people, but people are just purchasing less meat. What they're doing is they're buying, less healthy and less expensive sorts of food in order to try and get by. So if we go ahead and go to the next slide. As the production, the consumption of meat has decreased as the price has gone up, what has gone up also is the amount of ethanol, which is the corn is the primary feedstock for our livestock. The amount of corn being used in ethanol has continually gone up since Obama came in office. If you look back at, again, 2000, it was more of a novelty. It wasn't used it wasn't thought of as a heavy industry fuel source. Since the mandate, which the push toward moving into green and ethanol did begin under the Bush administration, but this has accelerated under the Obama administration. This graph here only goes out to 2010, but this has only increased. And as you see, 40% as of 2010 of our corn, which can feed livestock, can feed people. Some of this corn is not necessarily what you'll find on the kitchen table for dinner, the sweet corn, but this is the stuff that can be milled into cereals, cornmeal, grits, corn syrup, these kinds of things, instead is being used to fuel machines at the expense of people. Now, if we go ahead and go to the next slide, staying on the farm in agriculture, what this shows is the proportion of off-farm income to on-farm income. In other words, the households in agriculture, where their income comes from, whether it be directly derived from buying and selling of livestock, crops, these sorts of things, versus if you have a few folks in the family who are down at a factory or working on in a job. Oh, there aren't too many, factories right now, but in retail or some other of the services jobs that was shown during Matt's portion, and that proportion of the off-farm income to on-farm income has been growing over the course since the 1960s. And while the amount of income generated from the farm has remained relatively the same, it's not like with the increase of prices at the store for food, the farmers are making a whole bunch of money. That's not the case. And a corollary of this, which gets at what, again, Matt brought up during his portion of the presentation is this question of the lost generation. Because of this, because you have the fact of the matter is that farming doesn't seem like it's a good long-term career option. We're now facing the conditions in the United States and elsewhere where the average age of the farmer is into the 60s, that you don't have young folks getting into the noble profession of providing nutrition and food for the people of the nation, which is an increasing problem, especially if we're going to move to double food production. We're going to have to find the people who are able to do that. Now, so if we go back to the first graphic, where you have all of that cost increase. Now, like I said, this isn't going to the farmer. Just anecdotally, I was talking to a gentleman on the streets of Washington, D.C., a farmer who had come in to do some work with the Congress, and he was saying, you know, you take, for example, a box of cornflakes and, you know, it's $4, $5, whatever it is. The farmer only gets, you know, pennies of that. And the rest goes into the large businesses. It goes into the financial establishment in terms of derivatives, these kinds of things. That's what's happening. It's not a good situation. Now, and for more on that particularly, there's the Schiller Institute conference that we had in Washington, D.C. There's a presentation there which can be found on their website, which actually details what that looks like and why the farmer isn't getting the money. Now, with this difficulty of actually purchasing food, we've had many people turning to the SNAP program, the food stamps program. If we can go to the next slide. And this is to the tune of, these figures are for 2012. Now, what this shows, I know it's kind of hard to see on some people if you're watching it on your phone or in a smaller resolution. This is kind of difficult to make out, but what it shows is the amount of people who are actually taking help through the SNAP program, through the food assistance programs, and it's the darker shades are into the 10s and 15%, while the lighter shades are closer to the single digits. There's actually only one state, which is or two states which are in single digits here. Now, 14% of the population is one out of every 7 Americans. So this isn't just a bunch of poor people who are looking for a free lunch or anything like that. There are plenty of people in the underemployed category who rely on this in order to continue to live, in order to guarantee that they're, if not themselves, perhaps their children will have enough food to eat. Now, this graph here, which comes from the National Council of State Governments, doesn't show the change in people on the food stamp roll. And we don't have a graphic for this, but what I can say on that is that, again, if you go back to 1990, there was about 8% of the United States population were on food assistance, which is to the yeah, and in 2004, it was still around 8%, which was about 23 million out of 292 million people. Now, in 2008, it was 9%, 28 million people taking food assistance out of 304 million. Today, it's 46 million people. Again, 14%. If you look if you were to compare the number of people on the SNAP program between 2004 to today, it's doubled. So along with the unemployment, you have people, looking for assistance to get through, living life. Now, there's one other element which I'd want to touch on, which, if we go to the next slide, is the healthcare. What this shows is where there are critical access hospitals around the nation. Now, in the last year, and as Obamacare is being rolled out, the health care is already being slashed. I just want to point out a few key things. One is that the support for small and rural hospitals is being cut. There is a program called well, let's put it this way: the critical access hospitals, which are being recategorized and having cuts to them, with the idea of saving tens of billions of dollars. If the current proposals go through, as an example, in Iowa, where there are 80 of these rural critical access hospitals, 70 of them would be shut down. In Wisconsin, where there are 58 of them, 53 would be shut down. And there is some fight on this coming from the houses of Congress to stop that from occurring. But that's just one thing. Another thing is reducing Medicare payments. Classically, when you've had people who have been unable to pay their health care, and it goes off into bad debt, you would have Medicare come in and alleviate some of that so that the hospitals could still be able to function. That the intention is to cut that. Also, uncompensated care for charity patients is to be cut. There's been a recategorization of outpatient care, such that if you're in the hospital for less than 2 midnights, they're calling it the 2 midnight rule, then the hospital will be paid for outpatient service rather than inpatient. What that means is that it's substantially less money. And in the face of that, hospitals will be faced with the decision as to whether or not to continue offer certain types of emergency care under these kinds of situations. Also, Medicare payments for different outpatient services, such as nerve injections, neuropsychological testing. There's 66 different procedures which are listed as, having a cap on them, such that they're no longer be able to be funded. Penalizing hospitals for excess readmissions, which is already in effect. It came into effect on October 1st, 2012, where if somebody comes back in after having heart trouble too many times, there's penalties for this. So there's a lot more detail, which I'm not going to go into right here, but the sum total of it is that you have, on the one hand, the access to eating being more and more difficult for people, and the ability to have emergency care in health is increasingly being put further out of reach, or is slated to become absolutely impossible to reach in the case of some of these smaller hospital facilities, should they shut down, and that's the only facility within 100, 150 miles, how many people die on the way to try to get to another facility in order to achieve care? Will the hospitals even treat them knowing that they may not be compensated? Will that hospital have certain intensive and technologically advanced procedures being shut down because they're not able to get funding for it? These kinds of considerations are of a critical and strategic nature, because when we begin to take down this infrastructure, this is not something that's going to be able to be repaired overnight. This, along with the destruction of the different cattle herds and farming capabilities, agricultural capabilities, which take generations to rebuild, it's the same sort of thing here with the medical care. So that's what we have on that, and I'll leave it to you to...
Well, the problem is not an economic problem as such. All the details of economic is not the issue. Because what the problem is the intention on the part of trans-European, trans-American nations to follow the Queen of England's specific recipe for reducing the human population from the present level of 7 billion people in the world as a whole to less than 1. This is the explicit policy of the British Queen, and the British Queen is the mentor, shall we say, of Obama. So the policy that has been going on has been a longer-term development of the destruction of the people of the United States and of Europe, and also of other parts of the world. What you have is a relative situation in which Asia, or parts of Asia, the heavily populated areas, have not been as strenuously hit as Europe and the Americas. But they are about to be hit. They're about to be destroyed. Now this tension is what brings things to the point of a threat of thermonuclear war. And if thermonuclear war were to occur, I don't think anybody would be left alive. Because the nature of thermonuclear war is such at this time that the likelihood of survival of a general warfare, thermonuclear warfare, is such, that in one campaign conducted about an hour and a half could probably exterminate a good part of the human population. And these clouds would just go roving around and probably cause the direct or indirect death of civilization and probably the death of the human species. So that's what the issue is. And you have to remember, where are the policies made? Who is controlling the policies? How are the policies being crafted? And to what end? To what purpose? Yeah. The point is, the Queen says to reduce the human population from 7 billion people to 9. That is the personal, repeated proposal of the Queen of England. And that is what the real source of the tension is throughout the world as a whole. All of this stuff has been aimed, including warfare, stimulations, various kinds of quarrels in various cultures, religious conflicts. All these things are orchestrated for the purpose of breaking the population, reducing it, and as they did once a long time ago, as with the Roman Empire and other things like that, the purpose was to reduce the population, to crush it and make it stupid so it wouldn't be productive, in order to have the world dominated totally by what would call an oligarchical system. That's what we're dealing with. And the Queen makes it absolutely clear. The Dutch are the same thing as the British Empire. They have the same policy, a genocide policy. Look back in the occupation of India by Britain. What was the policy? Genocide. Yeah? Other parts of the world, genocide. So the intention has been to two senses of a population. One is the sense that we progress. Mankind becomes more powerful through technologies and through intelligence and things of that sort. And then mankind goes on to higher things, to higher technology. The other side is no. The old wars of chivalry, same thing. Like the Roman Empire, like the extermination of the population of a famous nation out there. And therefore, the policy of genocide and regulation of population to keep the population in the main stupid, but also keep them few. And this is what the policy that's being carried out right now. This is what you're looking at. Obama represents that. The Queen of England represents that. The Dutch system represents that. And other parts of the world are contaminated with the same kind of thing. So you complain about the effect. You know? You say the chief thing is the effect. The chief thing is not the effect. The chief thing is the thing that causes the effect. And the cause is willful. It's the oligarchical principle that is well known to any scholars of this. And the United States, where did the United States come from? Well, it came from actually Nicholas Acusa, a leading figure, religious figure of that period. It was the same Nicholas Acusa who prescribed to the associates of Christopher Columbus to cross the oceans, to get away from Europe in order to free humanity from the oligarchical effects of the oligarchical system. And since we established our nation, essentially in the Atlantic side at that time, that's been the rule. And the United States was the nation which was struggling to provide and raise the standard of living and culture of the people of the world. And the British Empire and their Dutch associates, other relics of the oligarchical system, were trying to do the opposite effect. That's why we have so few presidents who managed to survive what the British system and the Dutch system and similar kinds of processes, or what the British did to India, what the British and so forth, the British Empire did to India. Is it what the warfare you're seeing in the Middle East? What's the purpose of it? It's to cause people to be killed. You do your own self-made extermination, which is what's being done in Syria right now, which is being done in other parts of the world. So if you want to understand what the problem is, you have to come to an understanding of what the source of the problem is. And what the source is represented to be is not the true source. Look at Wall Street. What does Wall Street do? And everything like Wall Street. It parasitizes without compensation as much of the population it can. It destroys everything, as it has done, as was shown here. There's a policy of genocide against populations in order to reduce the human population to a very small quantity of very broken and poor people who will not resist. Why is there a green policy? The green policy, which is spread into the United States now, is a genocide policy. What's the effect of the green policy? It's to reduce the population. It's to make them more stupid, to make them less productive, to give them a less chance and don't develop them as human beings. And what we used to say all happened in the colonies. Buddy, we are one of the colonies. We are one of the colonies that might be able to stop this process, as we were always. Nicholas Acusa set that standard. He died before he was able to put the thing into effect. But it was his policy, because he knew what was about to happen in Europe. And what happened in Europe? A new reign of terror among nations, mass deaths, long periods of war, war beyond conception. And that's the issue. Do we want a human species, or do you want an inhuman variety of the human species? And that's the underlying issue here. Don't say it's because somebody made a mistake, in a sense, that they didn't intend to cause this effect. They had something they had to fix personally on their account. All kinds of motives were attributed to people for this kind of thing, like these great wars. What was the real purpose? The oligarchical principle. To crush the human race so that it's stupid. And so stupid that it can be controlled in population account, in what it thinks, and what it does. And where the struggle of mankind has always been, we are not animals. Human beings are not animals. So somebody tries to turn them into animals. And that's what's going on now. The intention here is to destroy the United States. And you may want to call it the United States after you've destroyed it. You saw that in the southern states where we had slavery. You saw slavery inside the United States. And the lurk of amongst large parts of the population of the United States, the legacy of slavery still exists. It's one of our major internal problems. And is still used as a device to weaken the United States by creating dissent within the United States on the question of policy, a principle of policy. Though the time has come when either, because there is thermonuclear power out there, thermonuclear fusion and other forms of thermonuclear weaponry. And look at the amount of thermonuclear power of weaponry which exists in the United States and around the world now. Look at the military forces which are aligned across Asia, into Europe, even down into Africa, and so forth. The world is prepared to commit mass suicide in wars over issues of this nature, over the oligarchical principle. And look at the facts. Don't take what the newspapers tell you. Don't take what you get as gossip. The fact is, there's a policy. There's a policy which has been destroying the United States since they successfully assassinated Clinton. That policy of assassination. And since that time, the economy of the United States has been in a per capita decline. That is a per capita rate of growth. And we're at that point now. Look at the poverty we have. Look at the conditions of life. Look at the standard of living. All of these things are all in one direction. Europe is being destroyed. It's being largely self-destroyed, as we reported here. And what we need is we need to go back to the United States. The United States, whose existence was actually the indirect effort of Nicholas Cusa. We in the United States and in other parts of the Americas in particular, who reflected the same process, created in the United States in our part of the world. And that United States was successful enough to inspire Europeans to fight against the atrocities in their own region of the world and to help us as we help them to bring about an order which is an anti-oligarchical order, which is our intention. That's what this is all about. It comes down to a simple practical problem, which we named before at the beginning of this operation here. The source of the thing is the fight of the oligarchical system, which is the enemy of mankind, herded by mankind, against the forces of struggle against the oligarchical system, which are typified by the creation of the United States. And it was the creation of the United States, beginning with the Massachusetts colony, Bay Colony, the beginning of that process which set into motion in the transatlantic world and elsewhere the kind of motion which created the United States successfully. But the British Empire, or the Anglo-Dutch Empire, in this case particularly, has been on the hide of the United States to destroy its presidents and others of meaning ever since. We are now being destroyed on the order of a British clown called Barack Obama. He's a stooge for the British Queen. And there's no doubt about it. Her policies are his policies. She has a policy. Reduce the population of the planet from 7 billion people to 1 billion people. That's her policy. That's his policy. That's his policy of practice. That's what he's instructed to do. How do you think we had all these atrocities? Because somebody accidentally had a bad idea? What's behind this? What's Wall Street? What is Wall Street? It's an extension of the British Empire. It's the British Empire controlling the United States. Go back in the history. Say, go back into the 19th century, early 19th century. Well, what happened? Well, the British Empire at that time set up a series of banks in the area of New York City and up in Boston. These banks became the instruments which controlled by the British monarchy, controlled directly, explicitly, and openly by the British monarchy. We had presidents who were agents of the British monarchy, many presidents who were agents of the monarchy, explicitly. That were their policies. So what we have done, we've caved in to sort of a kind of treason against our own nation, to accept people who invade our country with their influence, cause us to commit virtual suicide out of becoming stupid, largely through banking systems, financial institutions. And these are the things that have ruined the United States. But what was left was that still, almost to the present day, there is still a United States. United States which is a product, the outcome of what Nicholas Cusa inspired from inside Europe. Inspired eventually Christopher Columbus, and other pioneers across the Atlantic Ocean who built up national strength, or quasi-national strength, across the waters. This gave the power to Europe, within Europe, to free Europe from its own corruption, because nothing had succeeded. Take the Great Renaissance, the Golden Renaissance, out of which Cusa came. This was a powerful institution, one of the greatest institutions that ever existed. But it was isolated by relics of the oligarchical system, and it was therefore crushed in Europe. On that basis, Nicholas Cusa, who was probably the greatest intellect of that century, went out for a campaign. We must now move across the oceans to other places where we can set up a system for mankind which is not going to be crushed by the oligarchy. And that became what the meaning of the United States. That, for me, as for some others, is still the meaning of the United States. The function of the United States is to destroy the oligarchical system by assisting other people in other parts of the world to find the same freedom that we give for ourselves.